Hello, dear students. Today we will discuss The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. So, in this lecture, we will look at some details about the author, certain major terms that you need to be familiar with. Then we will look at the characters in detail. Then a plot summary. We will look at the major plot points, and then we will, as usual, we will have a discussion on the themes and symbols in the novel. So this is a fairly long novel, it's a fairly long work, and we have to discuss several things in this work. So we will probably do this lecture in different parts, maybe like 2 or 3 parts will be there to this lecture. All right, so let's dive right in. So let's look at some key details about the author, John Fowles. John Robert Fowles was an English novelist, but his fame wasn't confined to England. He enjoyed fame all over the world. His work has been translated into many languages and even adapted into films. And his works are, in a critical sense, we can say that they are positioned somewhere between modernism and postmodernism. So these are two literary movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. We will look at them in detail later on. And his major influences are the French philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And he studied in Oxford University. Then he taught English in Greece, where he wrote his first work, the Magus. And Magus was talking about the hippie culture that took birth in the 1960s, their anarchist philosophy and everything. And then he wrote The French Lieutenant's Woman, which is seen as one of the important works in postmodernism. It is set in the Victorian era, and there is, of course, a postmodern twist to it, and we will look at all of that in detail. Here I have given the list of John Fowles' works. So now let's look at a few key details about The French Lieutenant's Woman. Considering the genre of the work, it falls under several genre conventions. It is considered to be a part of postmodern literature. It is a romance novel. It is historical fiction. It is also historiographic metafiction and pastiche. We will look at each of these terms in detail. Then it was published on 10th November 1969, and it is written in a third-person point of view, mostly written in a third-person point of view. So as you may be familiar, what is a third-person point of view? When there is an omniscient narrator or an all-knowing narrator giving us the story, then we can say that is a third-person point of view. For example, all of the stories that we tell little kids, once upon a time there was a king in a faraway land. So the person who is telling the story is he or she knows the entire story. He knows everything that is happening in the universe within which the story is set. So that is why the narrator is known as an omniscient narrator or an all-knowing narrator. And the key thing is that the narrator himself is not part of the story. The narrator is not a character within the story. So that is the third person point of view in which almost the entire novel is written. But since this is a postmodern novel and they have postmodernists try to experiment with the form and bring in certain different things, different formalistic traits within their writing, in between the novel a narrator appears, a first person narrator appears and becomes a part of the plot. So the thing about the first person narrator is that the narrator is a character in the story. One of the characters will be giving us the story. I don't know if you watched this recent movie starring Biju Menon and Asif Ali, Talavan. So the person who is giving us the story, the Dilish Pothan's character, is also part of the story. His character is actively taking part in the story, but he's also telling us the story through a flashback. The most famous example of this would be the Sherlock Holmes novels by Arthur Conan Doyle, where the narrator is Dr. John Watson, who is Sherlock Holmes's companion. Another example would be Ishmael from Moby Dick. He is part of the story, but he's also telling us the story. So that is the difference between a third-person narrator and a first-person narrator. And this novel has both, which is which is not the norm. This is something that we usually don't see. And the setting is 1867 in a place called Lyme Regis in Dorset in England. Lyme Regis is a seaside town. It is located on the Lyme Bay. It's an actual place. Okay, so these are some basic details about the French left wing movement. So let's look at each of the terms that I just mentioned under the title genre. We will look at each of those terms in detail. First, let's look at modernism. So, like I said, modernism is it's a sequence of cultural movements. It started in the late 19th century, and it it extended into the early 20th century, somewhat almost till 1945, when the Second World War ended. So it included several developments in not just in literature but in architecture, art, music, and several other. It developed several techniques in each of these fields. So the major time period was between 1890 and 1940s. So a lot of literary works came up during this time. A lot of importance was given to literary works, and they emphasized the creation of original works. You know, what is an original work? Something that is like entirely new, a new painting, a new work of art, a new building or a design or a new sculpture. You know, they wanted to create something new, and original art was given a lot of importance during this time. And like I said, the time period of modernism is roughly between 1890s and 1940s. And a lot of social changes, political changes was happening at the time. Industrialization, urbanization, all of these things were going on in the late Victorian society, and people were reacting to it. And they were reacting to it through their art. And modernism is a response to all of this. And they liked grand narratives. They believed in big narratives, big sweeping stories. They wanted to show progress and rationality in their stories, and they believed in achieving universal truth. They believed that there was one truth. It's nothing. How can you say it? There is no subjectivity when it comes to truth. There is no your truth or my truth. There is one truth. That's what they believed. They aimed for a kind of purity and simplicity in art. They wanted their works to be original, but also very pure, very simple. And they also brought in some abstract qualities and minimalism and all in their works. They experimented with the form. They tried to innovate. They tried to bring something new. And they mainly tried to break away from tradition, they did not want to follow what was done before them, what was done in the generations before them. They wanted to create a new form of writing literature, and they established these new forms and expressions, and they tried to transcend the past. And they aspired to objectivity. Like I said, they believed that there was one objective truth. And they gave importance to the artist's vision. Every artist has a vision, no? They will have an idea of how to write their work or bring about their own work. They gave importance to that, but they also were all searching for a truth, a particular truth. Then they engaged with the political and social issues of the time. Of course, like I said, it was a response to the changes that was happening in their society. But they also did it with some abstraction, and they brought in some changes in their form. So they were engaging with the political issues, but they were also doing it with a kind of detachment. So that's all there is to say about modernism. Now let's look at postmodernism. As the name suggests, postmodernism comes after modernism, hence the post. So again, it's a movement that developed in the late 20th century. So it was after modernism, and it focused on philosophy, arts, architecture, and everything, and marked a departure from modernism. It tried to do something different from modernism. So postmodernism is defined by an attitude of skepticism, irony, or rejection towards these universal ideologies. Okay, so they believe that there is no objective truth. They rejected these objective notions of reason, human nature, social progress, and everything. And again, within this movement, we can see these schools of thought such as deconstruction and post-structuralism coming up. It comes under the broad umbrella of postmodernism. So it began in the 1950s and continued into the late 20th century. So as you can see, there were two world wars that had just ended, and this would be there would be a change in the thought process of society, and this is a reaction to that. It understood that their modernism had certain failures and certain limitations, especially when it was trying to address certain social and cultural phenomena. It had certain limitations. So postmodernism tried to fix that. And they rejected these grand narratives and a single objective truth. Like I said, modernists believe that there is a one truth, one objective truth. Postmodernists did not believe that. They believe that there is ambiguity and pluralism everywhere. What is ambiguity? Ambiguity is that there is a doubt in everything. A thing could be black. According to modernists, something can be either black or white. But postmodernists believe that there is shades of gray in everything. And truth is relative and context dependent. So depending on the context, what is true can change. We know that that's the case, right? What is true for me may not be true for you. And like I said, postmodernist works, because of this, they often have multiple perspectives and interpretations. And they incorporated pastiche, parody, and irony. So I will explain pastiche in detail later. And they borrowed from various different styles and sources, and they mixed all of it together. You can see this in this novel. As we move forward, you can see elements of this, like mixing different styles and different ideas in a work. So that is postmodernism, and they were open to reinterpreting, taking elements of the past, taking history and kind of tweaking it, giving it a different meaning, a different definition. And they also question the idea of a linear historical progression. What do you mean by linear historical progression? We believe in a timeline, right? First, the first thing happened, then the thing that followed it happened, which was caused by it, then the thing that followed that happened. But postmodernists believe that there is no one straight line to history. Several things are happening everywhere at the same time, and all of these things are interconnected like a web, and we don't know which event will influence another event. So that is the way in which postmodernists viewed history. And they believe that reality is a construction. There is no objective reality. Reality is constructed by us. It is constructed by our language, by our culture, and by our individual perspectives. So what is my reality may not be your reality. And they believed that the artist and the viewer both have a role in creating meaning. It's not just the artist who's creating art. It's not just the artist's work to create art. The viewers or the readers are also actively engaged in creating meaning. And postmodernism, compared to modernism, postmodernism was more overtly political. Earlier I said that even though modernists engaged in political and social changes of the time, they did it with a sense of detachment. They overnight involved ആയില്ല. അവർ ഇൻവോൾവ് ചെയ്തു, എൻഗേജ് ചെയ്തു, but while keeping a distance. Postmodernists were not like that. And they explored several issues like identity, race, gender, class in a more direct manner, in a more open manner. So now let's look at some of the smaller terms. What is a romance novel? Of course, you know what is a romance novel. It's a work of fiction that focuses on a romantic relationship between two people, and usually there is a happy ending. So this falls under the romance novel. Whether it has a happy ending or not remains to be seen. Then historical fiction. What is historical fiction? It's a literary genre that tells fictional stories set in a real historical time period. Okay, so you might have seen several examples of this. I have mentioned a Malayalam novel in class, August 17 by S. Harish. Uh, it has it's an alternative history of Travancore around the time of the independence movement. So a historical novel will have actual people who lived in a particular historical time period, or it could be centered around a particular era or particular event. There is another novel by there is a novel called Good Lord Bird by James McBride. It's a novel set in the American Civil War. Right after around the time of American Civil War, there is people were trying to free the slaves, and it features several real historical figures in this novel and how they, had. It's the story of a battle. It's an interesting novel. So I don't think you need much more explanation on what is a historical novel or a historical fiction. Then let's look at what is historiographic metafiction. This could be a term that you may not be familiar with. So historiographic metafiction is a literary genre that explores the relationship between history and literature. Okay, so there is like I said, postmodernists believe that history is a construct, literature is a construct. These are all things created by human beings. There is no such thing as history. സ്വന്തമായിട്ട് സംഭവിക്കുന്ന നാച്ചുറലായിട്ട് സംഭവിക്കുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യമല്ല. We are constructing it. We are constructing our idea of history. So this is why people say that, depending on who is writing the history, the story will change. The conqueror will write one history, the conquered will write another history. Depending on your perspective, the good guys in the story will change. So historiography looks at it's a study of history. It's a study of how historical events take place, right? So when you're looking at the term historiographic metafiction, you need to understand what is historiography and what is metafiction. So historiography is the study of methods used by historians in developing history as an academic discipline. അതായത് എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഹിസ്റ്ററി എന്നൊരു സ്റ്റഡി, ഒരു ഫീൽഡ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റഡി നമ്മൾ ഡെവലപ്പ് ചെയ്തെടുത്തത്, അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് പഠിക്കുന്നതാണ് ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയോഗ്രഫി. Okay, and by extension, historiography is any body of historical work on a particular subject. So ഏതെങ്കിലും ഒരു സബ്ജക്റ്റിനെ കുറിച്ച് ഒരു ഹിസ്റ്റോറിക്കൽ വർക്ക്, ഒരു ബോഡി ഓഫ് വർക്ക് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അതിനെയും നമ്മൾ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയോഗ്രഫി എന്ന് തന്നെയാണ് പറയുന്നത്. Now coming to literature, historiography can be combined with literature. Literary historiography എന്നൊരു ഫീൽഡ് ഉണ്ട്. That is the study of literary activity in chronological order with the goal of understanding several trends. So when you look at your syllabus, in the first semester, what do you learn? The history of English language, then English literature, right? You will learn the history of English literature in each era. First there was the Old English period, then the Middle English period, then we have the modern English. Within that we have several movements. We have the neoclassical age, we have the romantic movement, we have the Victorian period. In each of these time periods there were different trends. People wrote in different ways, people experimented with their writing, and the society of that time influenced the kind of works that were being produced at the time. So literary historiography is looking at how literature changes over time. Okay, and it can be focused on a specific region or country, or it can be like a total general history of world literature. Then metafiction. What is metafiction? Metafiction is a form of fiction that emphasizes its own narrative structure, and it reminds the audience that they are reading or viewing a fictional work. Okay, so usually when we read a story, the story is presented to us as fact, right? So consider the fables or the little stories that we learn, whether it's the Panchatantra tales or the Jataka tales that we learned in when we were young, all of those stories are presented to us as fact. Once upon a time, there was a king. The king wished for a boon which would help him turn everything he touched into gold. So we know that there was no such king, and this is a fictional story. But within the story, when the narrator is narrating that story, he or she is presenting it as fact, as truth. So that story doesn't know that it's a story. That story, the characters in the story are real people. They don't know that they are just characters. But in metafiction, what happens is that the story is self-aware. The narrator is self-aware. The characters are self-aware. They know that they are in a story. They know that they are mere characters in a story. And they remind us that they are characters. Okay. One famous example of this, considering movies, a famous example of this would be, I think, Deadpool, because Deadpool is constantly breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience, because he knows that he is a character in a story, and he is, dropping hints about that. So metafiction is kind of self-aware fiction, and the prefix meta is a Greek word. Meta has several meanings in Greek, but here it means self. The term metafiction was coined in 1970 by William H. Gass, that is the Gass, in his book Fiction and the Figures of Life. So that's just a little tidbit for you, just something to remember. So the term historiographic metafiction is actually coined by Linda Hutcheon, who's a Canadian literary theorist. And she did that in her 1987 essay, Beginning to Theorize the Postmodern. So she was writing about the postmodern trend or the postmodern characteristics of literature. And she found that metafiction, historiography and metafiction are show up in several of these postmodern works. So it has several characteristics, like it is self-aware, it is self-reflexive, and it uses these techniques like irony, pastiche, language play. So let's look at the characteristics of historiographic metafiction. It is self-aware. The novels are aware that history and fiction are human-made or human constructs. And it explores the inner workings of literature, about the form of the work or the narrative. Then it draws several parallels between literature and history. How literature is constructed, how history is constructed, what is the connection between the two. That is a main concern of historiographic metafiction. Then again, it problematizes the relationship between history and fiction. Here, the thought is that both history and fiction are narrative genres. That a fiction is narrated to us, right, by a narrator or by a narrative technique. In the same way, history is also a narrative. History is also a sequential order of events, and with the cause and effect of these events are shown. When this king went to war, then the other king retaliated and the first king's kingdom was destroyed. So that is cause and effect of history, right? So that is also presented to us as a story. So in postmodernism, people have understood that both history and literature are just stories, and they explore the connection between the two. And they also demonstrate that history is a construction. That is, the past can only be known through its textual remains. If nobody leaves any clues about the past, can we know about the past? No, we know about every previous era of our world because of the archaeological and historical evidence that they have left behind. So, based on all of those clues, we have constructed our view of history. We don't know if this is the actual history that actually happened in that time period. We can only take the clues that are given to us and put it together and come to a conclusion based on that. Now finally, pastiche. Pastiche is actually a literary device. We looked at a lot of poetic device when we were learning poetry, right? So this is something like that. It's a literary device and it imitates another work of art. and it is considered like a postmodern device. It's a postmodern technique. It's a form of intertextuality. So intertextuality is the connection between two texts, the relationship between two texts. So here, in this novel, specifically talking about the French Lieutenant's Woman, the writer imitates the Victorian novel. So the Victorian novel is this novel is written in that way, even though the writer is writing from a time period which is 100 years later, 100 years in the future from the time period that's presented in the novel. It is written in that form. See, John Fowles is writing this novel in 1967. He is not writing it as a person from 1967. He is writing it as a person from 1867, in which the novel is set. So it is imitating the form of the Victorian novel. So that's how pastiche shows up in this particular work. So those are, I have explained all of those terms, unfamiliar terms regarding the genre. So now let's look at some details about the novel. So it shows the relationship between two people, Charles Smithson and Sarah Woodruff. These are the two main characters. Charles Woodruff is a gentleman. He's a member of the nobility. He's a naturalist. To be specific, he's a paleontologist. He likes to study fossils. And Sarah Woodruff is an educated woman, but she's a social outcast, and they fall in love. And it shows several postmodern techniques. It focuses on metafiction, historiography, meta-history. Then it has elements of Marxist criticism and feminism. And Linda Hutcheon, the literary theorist that we previously mentioned, she described the novel as an example of a particular postmodern genre. So she calls this particular novel as an example for historiographic metafiction. And it's set in the mid-19th century. The protagonist is Sarah Woodruff, and Sarah Woodruff is the woman of the title. She is the French Lieutenant's Woman. She's also known as Tragedy, and she's also known as the French Lieutenant's Whore. That means the other characters in the story look at her as a woman of questionable character. She's an immoral woman. That is how she is seen. So these are the major characteristics of this novel, major details about this novel. We looked at the author, we looked at the genre in which the novel falls under. We looked at several terms and their definitions and some key details about the novel. So in the next part of this lecture, we will look at the characters and the plot in detail.